Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Drs. Gregory Seibert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to be talking about a very difficult topic in grief.
Grief shows up in much more ways than just the death of a loved one.
Yes. Yeah. What would be some examples for you?
Grief could be loss of a friendship. It could be loss of expectations. It could be losing an object or a job, but essentially a separation from something maybe that we cared about or had stake in.
Yeah. It could be loss of quality of life after like an accident or as we age, our health.
Even loss of our perceived immortality. I think about that with COVID.
Oof.
Right? We all think we're invincible to some degree, but COVID really brought to the forefront that even the healthiest of people, even the strongest of people are fallible.
Yeah. And COVID, I think, really has brought forth grief in general for a lot of people. If they hadn't experienced it before in their life, you know, there's all these feelings and emotions, like what's going on. And I mean, there was a grief in terms of loss of quality of life and expected life and just some of the liberties that we were so used to and privileged to have that it was taken away. I mean, even connections with friends and family during this time.
Yep. Being able to go where I want to go, how I want to do it. Right. Or if I thought, you know, my friend and I have the same views on this or the same political views through this process. And then I find out we don't.
Oh God, those came pretty outright during COVID.
Right? Can I hold space for that?
Yeah.
Or does that create grief in that now I feel like I can't be connected to that person?
Yeah. And I even think grief in the sense of our own belief systems and how they were challenged during this time, during COVID.
Say more about that.
Just if you had this expectation that we're protected and, you know, everything's going to go well, and then this hit, right?
Grief can look like, maybe I even think about in terms of pregnancy, not just infant loss, but maybe I wanted a boy and I got a girl. Maybe I thought my pregnancy would be really smooth and wonderful, and it wasn't. Yeah.
A lot of expectation, essentially going back to what you said, that loss of something that we cared about to that extent. And important with grief, and we're going to say this multiple times through this episode, there is no timetable on grief. And there's no rule book on how to grieve.
Everyone does it different.
I am very, very tired and also sad when I hear other family members and friends tell the one grieving that you just need to get over it. You need to get through it. You're grieving too much. It shouldn't take this long. And in fact, when we're supporting people with grief, we need to support them, let them take the lead.
Absolutely.
Because there is nothing that says that they need to be over this right now.
Absolutely. I love that point, right? The sense of, in my brain, that should take this long and this is what it should look like. That may look really different for the person sitting next to me.
Yeah.
My mom died almost 5 years ago. And even that, I look at how my grief process looked versus my siblings versus my dad, and they're all vastly different. We all coped in different ways. We all cried or was in that like really active, deep grief for different amounts of time. Some of my siblings still are in that stage.
Yeah.
And some aren't.
Yeah. And you may not go through all the things in the stage, and you may come back and revisit them in life. And so especially if we try to suppress this grief, if we don't process it, it will come up, or it might take longer in that process.
So let's talk about the stages of grief. So there's, and I want to give a caveat. We talk about them as though they're linear. Once you complete one, you go to the next. And that's not true. We tend to oscillate. We may cycle through them a few times. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that there's stages. Like once I've hit stage number 4,
I shouldn't be having to go back to anger.
I hate it because it's not that simple. So it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance.
I'm glad you remembered those, because I was like, oh my God, please don't put that on me.
I got you on this one. Grief is one of my loves. I relate with it intimately. And we think, okay, once I've hit acceptance, I won't grieve anymore.
It's not true.
Not true.
And originally when this model was developed, that's a 5-stage of grief by Kubler-Ross, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And originally it was supposed to be considered linear. And then she came back and was like, it's not linear. And you may not even hit all the stages.
You may skip.
you may skip, or you may just experience a couple of that. And I think that's really important, again, because it really highlights how we experience grief differently, and to not put that expectation on other individuals. And the most important thing, especially if we're going to be supporting people in grief, just be with them. Maybe even talk with them about the stories, the happy memories, to validate them in their grief by saying and talking about the process of their loss, and even the memories that they've had and shared, to kind of remember the good times. And
even the not good times.
Yes.
Right. Or what expectations were shattered, and validating how painful that must have been. What happens around the grief event, I think, plays a really big role.
Yeah.
So if we anticipate that loss, it tends to be, not always, but it tends to be a little bit easier than a sudden or unexpected loss.
Sometimes, yeah. And let's talk about anticipatory loss. So this is where we're anticipating the loss, and it may not have happened yet. And in these moments, it's very hard to be present. Some examples of anticipatory loss is somebody got diagnosed with a terminal illness. Somebody's aging, they're not doing well, where we can kind of anticipate that this is going to come up, or we know the relationship's going to end because one of us is moving away and we decided not to, but we're going to be together in this moment.
Right.
Some important things during this time is allowing that grief to be, and normalize it, and it's okay, and allow it to prepare for that loss, which we don't get to do in the unexpected.
Yep. I even think about, and going back to it, but this is one of my strongest feelings with grief, or strongest experiences, was with my mom. She'd been sick for a very long time, but in the kind of end stages for her, we knew she was going to pass. We chose hospice. And those moments, I think, helped shape how I grieved versus how some of my family grieved. So in that last week, my mom and I sat and had conversations around my hurt, things I needed to say and ask, healing I needed, but also giving her that healing, giving her forgiveness, or giving her my own apologies. And I think that made a big difference in my process, because then I wasn't left with, once she died, I just want to say, I just want to ask, I need that closure. I got it beforehand. And that can be helpful.
I love that you said that, because that is important. Communication about what you're experiencing, even anticipatory loss, with the person who's, might be the one moving on.
Yep.
That is really important to have those communications. And I'm glad that you actually had that opportunity to process.
One of the best gifts my husband has ever given me was the time and space to do that. He took our daughter, and I'm so grateful for it, because it left me feeling closure at the end rather than that longing. Whereas some of my other family didn't get that.
Yeah.
And that really hurts for them right now.
Yeah. And it's also important during those times to try to establish new memories. If you're able to, and even if it's through conversation, and reminiscing on the good times you've had, but also, again, creating new ones in the moment.
And loving them and supporting them through death, right? So in that case, like, really reassuring my mom that her beliefs are found, that she believes in God, and leaning into that, having a priest come and talk to her, things like that. Again, this is one type of grief, is that death of a loved one, the one we think of most often, right? Actually someone dying. But when we can talk about it, that really helps. That's true, even if it's loss of expectation. So if I wanted a certain job, or
Career
I wanted
change.
a baby and I couldn't, talking about it, super important here.
Yeah. And for those supporting, not trying to fix it.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that comes from the uncomfortableness of, I just don't want to see him suffering anymore, but it's not helpful.
So I want to make it better.
Yeah. Let them take the lead. Again, let them take the lead and guide that. And importantly too, is when you're supporting this, make sure you're not the only one supporting this, since it's the only thing you do. Take time for yourself. You're allowed to have that. If you need to bring in support, you need to bring in support and someone else to help out, which can be hard depending on the family dynamics, things like that. But please take time for yourself.
It's complicated, and it's a marathon. It's not a sprint here, people. Some people maybe move through grief faster than others. Some people say that they've moved through grief and they're really just shoving it down.
Yeah.
And then some people openly grieve for quite a while.
Oof, it's hard. I mean, it's very hard.
How do you see grief show up for your clients?
Oh, I mean, we talked about career changes, things like that for topics, but in terms of emotions, I mean, it varies. Some anger. I see a lot of anger in men. Sadness, disbelief, numbing. I've seen some clients where they just, for me, I don't say anything, but I'm kind of shocked. I'm like, oh, like, I'm surprised that you're handling it so well, considering how important this was. And I do, inside I worry a little bit of, are you really processing this? but I love working with them and trying to find some kind of ritual to make sure that this person is still continued in their life, you know, on a mental or an emotional level. And, you know, one client wrote a song for their mom.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and took all their music that their mom enjoyed, and even some of the favorite words or phrases their mom used, and put them in the song, and just finding a ritual to allow them to still exist in your life. You don't have to shove that out because the grief is so painful. Actually invite that in and continue to celebrate that person.
I love that.
Yeah.
Those rituals are important. It can look like a song. It can look like lighting a candle. For us, we put a flower in my mom's stocking every year for Christmas, but also talking about that person with my kids.
Yeah.
So keeping her alive through my kids.
I love that. You know, this is kind of a funny thing, which is kind of weird in the context of grief. But when I was learning about it through my master's training, there was a therapist who, and I thought it was a great idea, but they took the client who's experiencing grief and took all these things that were very meaningful to them, and kind of as a way to help them move forward, took these very important things and set them somewhere. And I think in this case, they threw them in the ocean. I was like, that's amazing. I was like, but you're littering. I was like, wait a second. Should we be telling people this? So like, I love the example, and I love how powerful that process was. But I'm like, should I say that and talk about that as an example? Because I don't want people littering and just like throwing stuff off the mountainside or something, you know? So,
you know, but maybe there's some time and place for it. Maybe.
Yeah. You know what? You're grieving. Who cares? Do what you need to do.
You get a free pass.
You do you.
Writing a letter to them.
Yeah.
People sometimes like attach them to a balloon or a lantern, or send them down a river, or burn them.
Yeah. And the important thing in what we're just talking about right now is none of these ideas are avoiding. They're leaning into it.
Good point.
Going through it. Whatever emotion you're going through, allow yourself to experience that. That is okay.
It's tempting to stuff it down, though. Feels much better to just, people use the word compartmentalize. I take personal umbrage with that, because people don't shove stuff down. If I can tell you anything, don't shove stuff down. Anyway, instead of shoving it down, maybe take it out in bite-sized pieces.
Yeah.
Do a little bit of processing that loss, and then move on to something else. We don't have to stay in the trenches 24/7.
No. And maybe those bite-sized chunks come out in a grief support group.
Yeah.
Or counseling, right? Where you're just processing, because it's not about solving this. It's about sitting with you in it. And how do we connect on this? And curiosity is so important in this context for anybody supporting someone through grief. Ask them about that person. What do they enjoy? You know, what were some difficult times? How did you get through them? You know, what were some of the best memories you've had and you were hoping for? And again, keeping them alive through these memories and discussion is very helpful way to process it rather than avoid it.
I have clients ask me all the time, how do I actually get through the grief? I've talked about it, so why is it not going away? So when people ask that question, what comes to mind for you of how do I actually process it? How do I get this to feel less heavy?
I mean, I got asked that same question. They just want it to be gone. And I have to reiterate again, like I said, it's going to come up many times, is it just has its own timetable. It has its own life. There's no rule book on it. And it may look different for you at different times. Maybe one time you handle grief really well, and another based on your standards, and another time it's very, very difficult. And you're even having physiological symptoms like nausea and things that you're like, what's going on? But it's normal.
And it may not come up in year 1, 2, 3, 4. May come up in years 7,
Might
10,
hit you,
12. Those random years, those random moments, a wedding, a funeral, it may all of a sudden dawn on you. I tell people, I think about a Chinese finger trap, right? The harder you pull out, you're less likely to get your fingers out, but you have to lean in, and that resistance lightens. Same thing with grief. I talk about it, not just in grief, by the way. This analogy applies through things like rebuilding trust, moving through conflict. But if we can lean into it, our psyche is much more likely to start letting it go or adapt to it than if we're trying to resist it and pull away all the time.
Yeah. It's tough. There isn't really an answer, right, for this. This is why it's so difficult. There's no cure-all to this.
And we wish there was. As therapists, trust me, I wish there was.
It's one of the hardest things I deal with when I work with clients. I mean, that's very, very hard. Even as a therapist, to go through that pain with you.
And we talk about even like complex trauma or complex grief where we have multiple losses in a row.
Oh,
And so now you're not just processing one loss, we're processing a lot. And that happened with COVID, right? Maybe we isolated, so loss of connection. Then we lost our job. Then maybe we lost our home. Then maybe we had a family member die. And so it's this complex building of all of these events of loss. And so taking it one piece at a time.
Yeah.
Which is really hard. Trust me, when I say sit with it, and when I'm saying lean into it, I know it's not easy. It's really, really hard.
Yeah.
But it will get better over time if we can take that approach rather than resisting it, which will take much longer to move through.
And that's why I love continue to celebrate that person and not avoiding that memory.
Yep.
Of them. I mean, I sit here in silence because it's just.
Even as we're talking about it, right? If I say the word grief,
Yeah.
or death or loss of a job, I know there are people listening that, feels like a sucker punch as they hear those words, right?
Yeah.
Or if I say death of a parent, like someone listening is getting that sucker punch.
Yeah. It's, I just feel I'm going back to just some of the clients that I've had and the things that their family members and friends and colleagues told them and how to get over it. I'm just like, how much more painful is that when you're told that you're not even grieving correctly? You're already trying to deal with this loss and then you're told that you're doing it wrong.
Get over it. Move on.
Just because you're uncomfortable doesn't move on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Please, everyone just drop that phrase. I'll hear people say, it's been X amount of time. How are you still upset about this?
Yeah. 2-3 years. I don't care. If you're grieving, you're allowed to grieve. That person was very, very important, or that situation was very, very important in your life.
Again, we don't have choice in grief, but we do have choice in how we cope and choice in the support we seek. So I often coach families on that. If they're like, gosh, my friend is still deep in the trenches. So we support them through it. Maybe we do offer, hey, I saw the support group. I'd love to go with you to it if they're open to it. If you're in the grief, yes, there is suffering that's inherent in grief, but the suffering can be lessened if you can lean into your support, lean into some different coping strategies.
If that support's not telling you to get over it.
Then they're not support in the first place.
One thing I want to talk about in the context of grief that I've seen come up quite a bit is this guilt to move on.
Yeah. Say more about it.
Some people are afraid to move on because they feel that person would feel that maybe they're not important enough. I can't move on. I have to hold on to this guilt and this grief to show this person I love them.
Talk about survivor's guilt too.
And that's tough, right? This image of what this other person would have wanted and convincing yourself it has to do with continue to suffer. Because if you're not suffering, then you must not have loved them.
I'll hear people say it feels wrong to laugh.
Yes.
It feels wrong to smile. It feels like I've forgotten them. So we hold ourselves in a place of pain in order to not forget them.
Yeah, I shouldn't. Keyword shoulding, right?
Oh, shoulding.
I shouldn't feel joy. I should be upset. I should be sad. And this expectation of what it's supposed to look like for themselves can also hinder that process.
This is a complicated one. And when we talk about survivor's guilt. So if I was with someone when they got hurt or died,
like a car accident,
or even if we both applied for the same job or same program for MFT, right? Or whatever, doesn't matter. And I got in and they didn't. Granted, they're not surviving, but this guilt of I got this and you didn't. I shouldn't be joyous about it because that would be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to how many different various ways grief can come up, whether we anticipate it or not. And oftentimes we don't anticipate that we would experience it the way we're experiencing.
And even pregnancy, I'd mentioned it earlier. So it's no secret. Like I have really tough pregnancies and people would say things. When I say tough people, I mean like my first trimester with my first, I lost 25 pounds because I was so sick and was in the hospital. I don't even know how many times with both my babies. And people would say, well, at least you got pregnant. Oh, well, it's just morning sickness. Or you should just be grateful you have a baby. And it is so invalidating.
Oh my goodness.
So invalidating, right? Yes, I'm of course grateful for my baby. And there's space for and it was miserable. I am both grateful that my loved one has relief from pain and I miss them deeply. I'm grateful I got this job and I'm really sad for my friend who didn't.
The and.
Yes. I
Not
talk
but.
about this all the time. Oh gosh, but
Yeah.
there's space for and. We can be both joyous and feel that sorrow,
Mhm.
that pain, that grief.
You can feel joyous, but you need to feel grief, right? We talked about this in the episode. The but language is
But language.
I love that you're using the and, yeah.
And it holds space for the complexity of that experience. We think we need to feel one way, and it's
Mhm.
not that simple.
Have you worked with moms who have lost a child in pregnancy?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's that like?
It's hard. We've lost 2 ourselves, but you can, how do I say this? A couple, a birthing person can lose a baby at any stage. It's obviously more common in the first trimester, but that's really hard when you have this excitement of, yes, I'm pregnant, and anticipation for what will be, and then it won't be.
This is why it's complex. You only lost the expectation of what it should look like. This individual, it's your child. I mean, there's a lot of different losses in that process.
And how you look at it. Some people might look at it as a baby. Some people might look at it as a medical fetus.
True.
Some people look at it as the first trimester or 2, not a baby, but now at 3rd it is. Or I look at it as I've lost a baby. And this happened for us when we lost one of ours. And my family members don't. They look at it as, it's just a miscarriage. Everyone goes through it.
Oh my goodness.
Or, well, at least you were early in your pregnancy. People don't say phrases like this. It is not helpful, but I see it. And it gets really hard in heterosexual couples. It gets really hard for the dad because the wife is experiencing the miscarriage and people acknowledge the wife and her loss. But men are really disenfranchised in this, that there is no acknowledgement for, they also lost their baby in that moment.
Yeah.
Or with ours, we had it's called a dilation and curettage, or a DNC. And the way I look at it as that was one of our baby's funerals. So they removed the baby from your body. And my husband couldn't even be in the room for it because it was surgery. So he missed that moment of me going from pregnant to not pregnant.
Oh my goodness.
And no one talks about that and what it's like for him in that moment. What pain is he going through? I don't know. It's very complicated, but yes, I work with a lot of partners. It's 1 in 4 lose their baby.
Wow.
And that's what's reported. So it's probably actually a bit higher.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's complicated because we have these ideas, expectations of what pregnancy will be and what's my baby going to be like. And then we never get to know.
Wow.
At least not Earthside.
And I do kind of want to touch on a little bit what you said too about how people said, oh, it's just the first trimester. It goes back to the idea of if somebody's experiencing grief, don't use your definition of what that was like for them. Let them lead that. And that includes how they are experiencing it. And if they feel like that was a child in this context, right, in that first trimester, then that's what it was for them.
You don't have to agree with someone's perception to still be supportive, right? I don't have to say, wow, that must be really hard to lose a baby. You could even say, like, what is that like for you? I can see that's hard for you.
Yeah.
I can see you're in pain. Can I bring you a meal? None of those imply agreement on what this should look like. It just shows support.
And don't follow it up with, oh, I can see how it's tough for you. Like, I probably wouldn't have experienced that because that's not how I see it. But
I had one family member who, when we lost our first one, he was like, why did you tell people that you were pregnant? Now you've hurt their feelings and you've made them sad. And specifically around my grandpa, one of my family members said, you should have kept it to yourself. You made him really sad. Talk about holy Nelly, shame cycle, disenfranchising of, now I feel bad that I've hurt someone else by way of losing my own child.
Added to that grief.
Whew, people, when you're helping someone through grief, please think about what you're saying and think about if someone had said this to you in your deepest moment, how would that have landed?
And one thing I do want to touch on in terms of grief is the idea of permanence that we all feel in the midst of it.
Good point.
And the amount of clients I've had after we've worked through, I say worked through, but they got to a point where it wasn't like immediate after, right? And they felt like in a much better place. And they said, I never thought I was getting out of that. And some of them would, reflect back on some of the things they wrote to themselves during this time. And they never thought they would get out of that. And they look back and like, that was very dark and deep. And I can see how when people talk about grief, at the end of it, you can potentially find some beauty in it, depending on the situation, but you couldn't see that in the moment. And understanding that the feelings you have now are not permanent. And they'll ebb and flow and they might dissipate. I mean, typically they dissipate over long periods of time, but it's not permanent. You will get through this.
Ooh, that is so powerful. Because when you're in the thick of it, the idea of seeing light, it's so hard.
I can't live without this person.
No.
I can't live without this. I'm never the same person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the idea that, okay, now I'm good, but then it sneaks back up by way of hearing a song or a moment or a holiday or whatever. Oh, I must be going all the way back to square one. Doesn't mean that either.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm. And can you hold space for someone who 5-10 years later, all of a sudden is hit with that grief again? Can you say, wow, like talk to me about that? Instead of saying, okay, it's been 10 years. Or even, and it's all well-intentioned, right? I've had clients where their partner doesn't know what to say. So they'll be like, brush it off, or, well, they're in a better place, or, okay, well, let's go do this, and just tries to distract. And that comes from a loving place of not wanting to be back in that pain place. Instead, I invite people to pause what you're doing, give that person a hug and say, tell me what's happening. What's going on for you? Tell me what's coming up. What brought the thought of your friend up, whatever.
If you're in a space to take it on, and if not, go engage in self-care, learn how to self-soothe so you can be present for that person.
Good point.
Because if we're not, typically physiologically it gets uncomfortable. And then when we're physiologically uncomfortable, that's when we typically provide more solutions at that time. If you find yourself solution focused and trying to give advice, maybe that's not the best time for you to be supportive. And recognize that for yourself.
For grief too, honoring. So I lost my mom, but honoring what was my husband's experience like in losing my mom, and watching me go through that pain place. I wasn't the only one that lost someone that day. He did too. Our daughter did. So how do I give room for them too? Even though it was a more central loss for me, how do I give room for the whole system?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And if I can't, how do I still invite other people to support him? Whatever it might be.
And it can be helpful to, if you have shared loss, to share that, right? To share that with the people that you can relate to. And typically it's a bonding moment for many people who have shared that loss, because they can talk about it. Your experiences don't have to be the same, but you've all lost maybe like the same thing. And maybe it's not within a family system. Maybe everyone just lost their job at a company, and that was really tough for them. And people can talk about that, unexpected loss of a career.
Or fire, when everyone loses their homes.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And join, right? This is why support groups exist, is because it brings together people who have similar experiences. And that's the same with grief.
If you are looking for therapeutic support, finding someone who's knowledgeable about grief. We're going to say this on just about every topic, really finding someone who's knowledgeable. Because it's such a delicate process, you want to have someone who's skilled in grief to work through that grief.
Work through it and with it, not solve it.
Yep. It's a journey, people. There is no one solution here.
This one is interesting. I don't know if you've come across these situations. I haven't had a lot, but where a parent is grieving kind of the loss of the adult child's future that they anticipated for them. This idea of who they wanted their child to be and didn't. And there's a lot of grieving of that loss and then blame on themselves. Have you ever seen that?
I see it with I shouldn't say kids, teens, young adults who choose to go a different career path, or even for folks who identify as LGBTQ, or if they move away, I thought they would take over the family business. Having to reconcile what I thought would be and what actually is. So much of grief work for me, and I'm working with people, is acceptance work. Accepting what is now, even if I don't like it.
That is the hardest work.
Yes. But again, it's a process, right? It's accepting that this person's not coming back. It's accepting that my child isn't going to be who I wanted them to be, who I thought they should be, right? Accepting them for who they are. Accepting I didn't get that job, and that really sucked. It was awful. And I have to accept truth. That takes time. It's not like all of a sudden we wake up and, okay, I'm good. But so much this is acceptance of building a new normal, a new sense of moving forward than what we thought would be.
And they talk about that a lot, like don't stop your life. Now, initially, when it's very deep and powerful and impactful, take some time for yourself.
Absolutely.
But don't stop living. Do not stop living.
Yep.
And I was hoping to find a way to bring boundaries in here, and I did, because we bring it in almost every episode.
We missed an episode.
But the anticipatory loss that we're going to expect when we actually set boundaries with people. During COVID, I've cleaned house. I've thought about who's important in my life. And I know a lot of people have in the situation. Like,
hey, I made the cut. I made the cut.
I must have made your cut. Yay. But it's kind of, I'll give just one example. And it's not, I didn't do this, but I'm looking at some clients I've had where they've had to unfortunately put boundaries up with their parents because they have recognized that they aren't the healthiest in terms of their ideologies, especially for where they want their kids to be. And so there was this anticipatory loss of putting these boundaries up of I'm not going to have them in the same capacity anymore. And then you're going to experience grief in that. This grief, again, going back to the expected of what you wanted them to be. And now they're not going to be maybe in your life in the same capacity. Even if they're still in your life, you can still have loss about the type of relationship you're going to have. And that will happen with boundaries, depending on how rigid you put that, depending on the context.
I love that point. People talk about that of, if I put this boundary up, I might lose them.
Yes.
You might. That isn't a reason not to do it.
Exactly.
Right? If the boundary is truly healthy and is in service of your health, that's not a reason not to. Because sometimes people aren't healthy for our space and we have to put that boundary, and that hurts. In some ways, it also might equal relief, right? And I am relieved that I no longer have this criticism in my life, and I long for what could have been. We talk about an abusive parent or an alcoholic parent, who I want as a mother, right? So I see my friend has this really close mom.
Yeah.
Man, like I'm jealous. I am angry. I feel like I've missed out because she gets this parent that I don't. But I have to set that boundary, right? Or I have to come into acceptance that I may never get that Susie Homemaker kind of mom.
This is kind of interesting. And more recently, this is one of the toughest boundaries I've seen had to be put in place. And it's happened on multiple situations with different clients. Is the adult child has to put boundaries with their parent because their parent wants to be their friend. And when I mean that, they're talking about the relationships and who they're dating and going into this context and sex and wanting to be a friend because that parent doesn't have anybody, and how difficult it is because they still very much love them. Their parents not doing anything wrong in their mind, but they recognize that that's unhealthy, and they don't get the support they need because they're too busy supporting the parent. And talk about, just a shock to the system of I have to put a boundary with a parent so they can be a better parent.
Yep. Or spoiling, right? So a boundary of, okay, my parents love to spoil our kids or whatever, but I have to put a boundary of, okay, I can't have you spoil them every time they see you. Their spoiling or their giving of gifts or whatever it might be is out of love, but it goes against the values maybe I have as a parent. So therefore I have to put a boundary.
Out of love I want to make sure they love me the most as a grandparent. And I want your house to be a wreck with all the toys I buy, and see how you deal with that because of what you did to me as a child.
Over here. So bad. So bad.
It sounds like the ritual for them grieving you leaving the house and starting your own family.
Those can be really complicated because I know it's out of love, right? I know that they are perhaps practicing their own love language of gift giving. And if I don't find it healthy or functional for my family, putting that boundary, which may lead to disconnection in relationship. It may lead to points of grief, conflict, or whatever it might be. Yeah. Oof. Grief's a hard one. We all will experience it at some point, just in different ways. Some people battle it a lot more than others.
Yeah. And we'll definitely be talking about this again, and we'll be bringing in some guest speakers that this is their world on an everyday level to talk about, and maybe even somebody who's experiencing grief to go through that process and help normalize the process for everybody. And we'll touch on it more. We just kind of touched the surface today. And, if you have any questions or comments or anything else you want to add, don't hesitate to reach out to us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com or leave a comment. And as always, thank you so much for listening to us, where we dissect relationships of all sorts, including the self, families, relationships, community. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.